Because these frameworks are coming out so fast, the ability to spend time to become really good at this is sort of lacking. We want the developer who is at the forefront of this to go down that journey and make it more secure.
A lot of the aspect of security that we struggle with in the development community is that it's all sticks and no carrots.
Anything you write should be thought of that. You should expect that there are bad people out there that would want to expose things. If you have a security designated role and make that part of that design before any code gets written, that has a great impact.
Hi, I'm Guy Pojarny, CEO and co-founder of Sneak, and you're listening to The Secure Developer, a podcast about security for developers, covering security tools and practices you can and should adopt into your development workflow. The Secure Developer is brought to you by Heavybit, a program dedicated to helping startups take their developer products to market. For more information, visit heavybit.com. If you're interested in being a guest on this show, or if you would like to suggest a topic for us to discuss, find us on Twitter at TheSecureDev. Hi, everybody. Welcome to The Secure Developer. Thanks for listening in. Today we have Sabin Thomas with us. I'll let him introduce himself in a moment, but he has a lot of experience building and leading engineering teams in security companies, as well as companies that, don't focus on security, but actually do security. So has a lot of sort of knowledge for us that I'm eager to tap into and have you listen to as well. Sabin, thanks for coming on the show.
Absolutely.
And if I can ask you to just introduce yourself a little bit, what's your history, maybe how you got into security?
Yeah, sure. It's I think I have more of a varied sort of path in the security space. I would say this is one of the more recent explorations for me. My past has been over 15 years working in software, doing everything from enterprise, HR systems, HCM systems, financial institutions, and then more so e-commerce, search, advertising, and then now developer tools, and then with a very big security focus. So it's been a great journey. I think this is the most interesting of all of them.
Oh, cool. Yeah, definitely not a small feat to get sort of developer tools and security. And I guess you work at Codiscope today. Do you want to just sort of up a little bit on what Codiscope does?
Absolutely. So my role is the VP of Engineering at Codiscope. Codiscope has been more than a year and a half into its inception. We are based in Boston. Primarily, we are a developer tool company. We do a number of things. One of the number of things that we do is specifically security tools aimed at developers. We've had almost 6 to 7 years of experience in terms of the people that we have in our company that have been working on developer solutions for other stacks, Java, .NET, PHP, and have got a good amount of experience in that type of realm, that type of field. We also have a specific division of our company that's focused on e-learning content and educational materials, specifically aimed at security-themed courses, helping developers get better, improve their security knowledge. And now, over the last year, we've been refocusing our efforts now specifically on JavaScript and a different model at understanding code and making developers code securely.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and actually I have a whole bunch of questions that come out of that question. So I guess first of all, you mentioned developer tools and the focus on developer. Clearly we need security knowledge, right? There's a lot of problems out there. Why developers? Like why developer tools versus just, I guess, the typical InfoSec and security tools?
Yeah, and that sort of has more to do with the genesis of Codiscope, I would say. So a little bit of background there. Codiscope, as a company, we were spun out of a company called Cigital, which has close to 20 years of experience in application security consulting. They've been doing this for a long time, and they have a great enterprise footprint. And the reason for the spinoff was that as a product, we would have that much more impact if we were able to touch the developer. Traditionally, security, especially in enterprise companies and regulated industries, have sort of been mandated from the top down. Management or a security team or the CISO in these companies would certainly understand the need for it. There's an obvious risk with doing insecure code and would turn that around and mandate that to the development team to use the tooling, the processes, and so on. And we felt there was a different approach to that where we could go directly to the developers, have that experience be very native to their development environment, and really make some impact there to the point that they feel that that's part of their tool set. So the aim is still the same. We still want secure code. We want the developer who is at the forefront of this to go down that journey and make it more secure. And that's what we feel gets the most stickiness in our approach to it.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I think as the pace of development grows, and just the impact of an individual developer in just the throughput, right? How much can a single developer achieve today in terms of new functionality just becomes staggering, right? You can do a ton of things, which is awesome. It also implies that really anybody, I think, outside of development is just not able to keep up, right? Let alone an understaffed or just, shortage of talent security team. So to an extent, we really have no choice but to get developers involved. So it becomes, not really a question about whether developers should embrace security and, sort of start acting on, and using, applying some security best practices, but rather, how do we make that happen? Clearly, it's a necessity if we have, sort of any chance of winning kind of achieving some form of security. So a lot of it is just about how do you get developers engaged. So I really like, and, like we do the same at Sneak, right? We're focused on saying, this is developer tools that do security. And I feel like just by that statement, there's an indication of focus, which hopefully I'm seeing a little bit more of, and hopefully kind of keeps growing in the space.
Yeah, I mean, just to match the need as well. I mean, the need for developers is at an all-time high. Everything everybody does always has a software component to it. That's one piece of it. The other piece is that developers have a 5-second attention span, so it's whatever framework they're working in. The next one is obviously cooler and better. And so with that kind of churn across frameworks and that kind of repetition, I think developers are just prone to doing things incorrectly. Not because they're malevolent from the start or they have intent that way. It's just the pace and keeping up with these things means that you just can't be an expert at everything. So compare yourself to the Java developer who's been working on it for 20 years, has basically covered every aspect of Java, the tool set. And then the developer who's been working on, Node.js, Swift, Go, take your pick in the next 2 years. So it's
may not know where the pitfalls are, right?
Yes,
you may not sort of have that experience.
So I think just with the amount of time that you have to spend on this, you are not able to spend the time to really understand it, to get to know what you're coding and make that secure. So tooling is even more important.
So when you say it's developer tools, like practically speaking, right, you've sort of seen in Cigital and all that building pretty much the same, maybe, security, especially for the education tools, right? It might even be sort of the same tools, but here at Codiscope, you're trying to make this developer tools that do security. Like, how do you see that manifest in the product? I mean, what makes the product more compelling, a security product more compelling to a developer?
Yeah, and I think a lot of that is tied into what we've recently launched a few months ago, a product called Jax, jax.codiscope.com. Definitely try it out. The way we approached this product was very different from how we did our past products. The understanding being that we wanted to approach developers first, and again, not something that was mandated onto developers. So in that model, we really looked at how GitHub, a lot of other tools that have had a good amount of developer traction, New Relic, where these tools were just simple enough for the developers to understand where it fit in their ecosystem. That the model was pretty solid. So we took a look at that. We understood where we wanted to fit in. We also understood, as part of our mission to have developers code securely, that the educational aspect of that was very important. I think developers certainly want to know when they're doing themselves a good job, when they've been able to work with the framework correctly, they've been able to do the right things in their code. What is sort of missing in the tool sets that's there right now is an inability to track that. There's no ability to say that, hey, you've actually become a pro programmer in Scala and you've done package incorporation correctly. So that type of analysis or that type of tracking is missing. And so we felt that combining the need to have a secure tooling experience along with the educational experience would establish that kind of environment that a developer would want to. So we approached that. That was very much the part of our product design from the very start. We took a brand new, fresh new look at it at Jax. We spent a good amount of time understanding the user experience, what developer would really want, what would accelerate them, how would we accelerate that dev cycle instead of being like a deterrent or a new body of work.
Yeah, not being a gate, right? Like
right. Yeah, which is I would say sometimes the case with most security tools. There are findings and you have to now spend time to work through them. We want it to be an accelerant. And so, we're still tinkering with it. There are things that we measure everything about JAX. We track and try to understand, is the developer faster now than he or she was before that product?
Yeah. I had this really good chat with Camille Fournier, who's a CTO in New York.
Yeah.
And she had this sort of quote that said that she feels that security, in the case of security tools, you pay to get more work.
Yes.
You just sort of pay out, and it's sort of not what you want, right? Like if you're paying, you want to sort of achieve better security, maybe you are, but you want them to make it easier, not harder, not sort of send you down sort of that path.
And it's in just looking at that as well, it's a tricky thing to do. I mean, to find out if a developer has really done this correctly takes a good amount of analysis, it takes a good amount of understanding of the behavior. And we're still finessing with that. I don't think there's necessarily the right way to do it. There's certain nomenclature we try to stay away from in terms of all our products, which is something that says that you fixed something in response to vulnerability that was triggered. So unless we're absolutely sure, we don't want to say that a fix has happened. What we can tell is these packages look like you've done this correctly. This code you've written looks like you've done this correctly. And so that's the path we're going down. We don't want to be too forward in saying that you've done this correctly without making sure that that's absolutely right. And I'm sure, in the early versions of the product, these are things that we're still figuring out. We'll iterate on that, but that is certainly the mindset, the goal of where we want the product to be, when it's at the point it's mature.
Yeah. I think when you talk about developer tools as well, first of all, there's the 5-second, attention span aspect, which is like pretty much how much you get when you build a developer tool. True. To sort of demonstrate value and to show ease of use. So, historically, well, not historically, at present, even the vast majority of security tools today, you need loads more time than that just to be able to get them up and running, let alone starting to operate them on your system. So you have to have quick onboarding. And in general, just sort of an understanding that even the exact same core technology, be it security static analysis or be it really any other, or authentication or, whatever sort of vulnerabilities and dependencies, any of these components, the same core technology might be at play, but the surrounding of the product and how easy it is to use and how easy it is to get going is quite critical. I feel like there's an interesting conversation as well to be had around education and tooling and sort of this virtual cycle between them, right? How much education do you need to do upfront versus how much can tooling do for you and, almost sort of reduce the need for you to know? And, how can the two work in tandem to basically, help on one hand, reduce some of the effort from you, just sort of do some of the stuff for you and ensure the tools are secure. And at the same time, surface things to you in line with the work that you're doing. So instead of you going off, for instance, to do like a 3-day course and learn about secure coding, how can you have some of that education around making mistakes be a natural part of, as you code, you identify these things and, you just repeat that enough that to ahead of time not make that mistake, allowing you to basically take it up to the next level. I think an aspect of that is with automation tools and with static analysis and such. But some of it, I think you do is, I don't know if it's Secure Assist, right? Or like you have the inline in the IDE types of security education. Do you see that paying dividends? Like, do you see people over time making fewer of the same mistakes?
Yeah, certainly. With Secure Assist, which is one of our products in our portfolio, the intent is very much that, be as native to the developer experience. And the way they do that is by being an IDE plugin. Right now they have IntelliJ, Visual Studio, Eclipse, some of the major browsers. And as the developer is in that, as they're coding, those are right opportunities where we can inject the right type of education to do that correctly, especially in response to something that's been done. I think teaching when somebody's been able to see for themselves that they've made that mistake or that something that was incorrect, I think that is the right point at which it becomes sticky. It is a little trivial sometimes in the way that people write code or developers write code where you can almost attribute it to like a syntax type approach. There are more complicated vulnerabilities or inaccuracies that can happen that may not work so well in that type of experience. And so this is where we're finding that even with languages, we're seeing that manifest. So if I'm talking about a Java code base, I can be assured all of that is typically in just one repo. In the analysis that Secure Assist does, we can find out from the way you've initialized your application routes or web routes to the way you've initialized your database. All of that is in a single repo, and we can sort of figure that out. In more modern frameworks, more dynamic, I would say even with JavaScript, that's split across 25 different repos. And making that connection can be a little complicated. And so to get that full holistic understanding of the code you're writing, the corrections that we offer have to be in line with that. So I would say there's certainly still a need to have developers be educated at the point that something we've noticed is amiss, and as you're coding is the right time to do it. But I'd be remiss if we don't do that holistic understanding. And so that's where a tool like JAX is a little different in that you invoke it primarily on your cloud-based repos. And I think we're still figuring out what the right model is. I think it's a mix of both. It's a little challenging for newer frameworks because an IDE is almost a non-existent concept, I would think, for a Node.js developer, especially somebody who's been, if they've started with Node.js as their first programming language, I would say that an IDE is probably the last of their concerns. It's usually text editor or something like that. So
they're going to be in Atom or in Sublime. Or in
Sublime,
some
right.
form. Yeah.
So in that scenario, for a developer who's been using something like this, they don't really expect a lot of the IDE. They don't expect a lot of feedback out of the IDE. And so where they're expecting feedback and possibly educational material is a little later on in that build chain. And so that's a little more native to them. Whereas if I talk to the Java developer, they want everything to happen in the IDE, the ability to debug, the ability to run debug builds and do stack traces. So there's a different nature of developer. We want to be the answer to both of them. So this is where we'd like to work with the community to see if there are other things beyond the build chain, beyond the IDE, where we can inject that.
Yeah, and I think like developer is not one thing. Different developers clearly. For starters, it's just people, and people work differently. But also the norms of or the best practices for how to develop software. It may be then in the world of JavaScript, it will be typically slightly more continuous processes. There will be a higher percentage of people that have some sort of CI, test automation, continuous deployment processes, maybe as compared to maybe the average in Java. But you're right that at the same time, the development environments themselves, the debugging tools, those are anywhere from less mature to non-existent, and building them there. I also like you mentioned this notion that sometimes you can't identify an issue in a smaller context. Oftentimes the lack of existence of a security control, like the fact, for instance, that you did not validate input or that you did not encrypt some piece of data, that by itself is not a security flaw right there and then, right? Like that's not a vulnerability. But if you did not have that security control throughout the flow of an action, suddenly your system becomes vulnerable, right? And there's some learnings there. Yeah.
Specific to instruction, though, there are many mechanisms that have been valuable to the developer. There's certainly, the old school method of development where you have a 3-day instructional seminar that's on site that all your enterprise developers have now are sort of required to take. There's e-learning courseware that they can take on their own time and sort of measure their progress that way. I think the challenge with any of an instructional mechanism is that without the appropriate tracking and the appropriate metrics, it's very hard for a developer to know what use they've gotten out of it. And so this is where we were looking to answer that with JAX, which is because of the way you've coded and because of the way you've interacted with our courseware, we have an understanding to say that you may have a predisposition to coding these insecurities or these vulnerabilities in your new project, and we want to avoid that. So, so that's certainly the goal.
I like the notion of it's almost like continuous education, right?
Yes,
as you do a part of that, right? It's
absolutely.
Not security is a moving target, but also in general, the ability to absorb information, in one time and then remember if you might not have a chance to apply it. Remembering that, if a few months later you come across that is hard, but if it's constantly there, constantly pointing decisions and questions for you, you can evolve it.
And so just to close that out as well, one of the things that we've done in talking to our customers that have been using our products for a long time, we find that the thing we're always asking is what level of security training is happening currently? And then also in our developer outreach, when we're talking to devs or new graduates, the question we ask is what kind of security training have you received in college? And the answer to all of them has been none. We've actually gotten responses from customers asking if we could create security training for college level academia type usage scenarios. And so the fact is, we are almost 40 years, I would say 15 years into mainstream software education, and the fact that we still don't have that speaks volumes.
Yeah.
So what's happening is a lot of people are learning this on the job. They're learning it as a result of an incident that has happened. And at that point, it's almost, I would say, fatal to have to learn it from that type of scenario. So there should be a better way to do it.
Yeah, precisely. You should be able to sort of preempt them.
Yeah.
So I guess, maybe switching to security education itself,
Sure.
you see a lot of, you have these tools, you educate developers about security solutions. You see a lot of actual mistakes or a lot of interest in specific ones. Can you share some insight into, some of the common or the most common mistakes you see or conversations you have?
Yeah, it sort of varies by the nature of the developer. What we find among our clients is that they will engage us for a certain type of curriculum, and the curriculum could be varied depending on the client. A client would want sort of introductory security training, sort of defensive programming in Java. How do you prevent buffer overflow vulnerabilities in C++? Like basic stuff that is also a good reminder. It sort of checks off certain boxes in the security team to make sure that developers are doing this year after year, remind them about it. But our focus is to make that material fresh and relevant and to make that contextual to what you're coding in. So we find from our experience in e-learning and the type of questions we're getting from our clients, the type of use cases that we want, that we feel that e-learning still has a good amount to go to make it that much more relevant. And that's what we're taking to heart with our product development with JAX. So the other question you had was...
Yeah, just like this is very useful on the types of security education that people actually, I guess explicitly ask for.
Yes.
Do you, like on the flip side of that, if you look at mistakes, right, through JAX or through, the IDE assists, which mistakes do you see are most common? Like, what do people not do or incorrectly do that exposes them to security problems? Yeah,
one of the things that we always find, especially with Node.js repos, is just whether they're using Mongoose or not using Mongoose, or the native Mongo driver is basic SQL injection. SQL injection in MySQL or SQL injection in MongoDB still happens. And it's not so much, I would say, a developer vulnerability that we find. It's just an inaccurate use of the product, I would say. And this is, again, part of what I was saying earlier, because these frameworks are coming out and so fast, the ability to spend time to become really good at this is sort of lacking. And sometimes it's also a result of documentation just missing.
Yeah,
But if you use the find operator, or if you use the where operator in MongoDB, and you don't filter your input, that's a big scenario at that point. But I think frameworks are getting a little better. So if we're looking at Node.js, between the people that use Express and Happy.js is a big difference. There's people who are using Happy.js at the very outset, developers, those repos are pretty good to start with, because validation is a big part of Happy.js. So I think that sort of mindset is really good. We sort of encourage developers to go that way. RDoS is also a big thing. Regex, denial of service, that always happens. People just don't know what to do with it. And I'm surprised the number of developers that come out of, really strong programs, a lot of these schools, and still say regex is a little complicated for me. So
it's
they need help.
I think just to kind of give a little bit of info for those who don't know it, regular expression denial of service, these RDoS vulnerabilities are the case where executing a regular expression takes a very long amount of time, right? Yeah. Regular expression with all its back references and kind of logics that it needs to match can take a very long amount of time to run, even on a small string. Definitely a non-linear amount of time as compared to the length of the string. So it's fairly easy to, if you don't restrict the length of an incoming string, which is something you often omit, to get to the point where that thread spins quite a bit, and especially if you're in JavaScript where it's single-threaded, or not single-threaded, but it scales by events, not by threads. You can really fairly easily take down a system, a machine, and kind of introduce denial of service.
Another thing that we also see is incorrect use of crypto libraries. I'm surprised by the amount of code where people use math.random to seed a key algorithm or something like that. Is just the wrong thing to do. But they haven't been taught anything else, and unless they get the type of education that should preempt them from using math.random, they will continue to use it. So that's one of the popular things that we see as well.
Yeah, and I think education is an aspect, and tooling or better defaults is an aspect of it as well, right? In the case of the Mongoose usage, I feel like the big platforms Angular, React, they come in and they put a lot of emphasis on security. And while imperfect, they still have very secure defaults, right? This notion of secure defaults, of taking on responsibility, of not checking off to say, this is not my responsibility, just makes many of these components, make it harder for you to make a security mistake. Many of these packages just don't do that, right? Sometimes they're just small. They might not have the capacity in terms of the amount of investment that's been put into them, might not have the security knowledge. Sometimes the authors of them perceive them, because they're not a platform, but rather a component. Somebody says, yeah, of course I don't, filter my SQL injection in the relevant functions in Mongoose. It's not meant to be used that way. But that piece of information about how it should and should not be used just goes away. And really, I would hope that over time we evolve into some model that is a little bit more defense in depth oriented, right? To an extent, I find the NPM package or the Maven package, or in general these open source packages, and as you use more and more libraries and you chain them together, because these libraries are developed out of context with each other, right? They're just developed independently. There's no guarantee that the use of those packages is going to be done correctly from a security perspective. The only way to kind of help assure some of that security is to build it in, is to actually have each of these components have defense in depth, have every one of these components enforce its own security restrictions, even if it means that you've gone through 7 of the same check. You eventually have a shot at not letting an attack through.
And I have to think, what is in the mindset of a developer? As a developer, if I'm coding something up, if I'm doing a blog app, or I'm doing a very simple website, I can understand the mindset there to say that this is not something that's going to be used by a lot of people. Why would I need security? And I know the way that I would think about something like this, 15 years ago has changed a lot from when I'm doing that now. So anything you write should be thought of that. You should expect that there are bad people out there that would want to expose things, or maybe an incorrect usage of your application completely, not because it was a nefarious intent, but because it was just there. So I think that mindset is changing. That's a good thing for developers to understand that anything you write, anything you put out there, anything you deploy, no matter what it is, if it's from a simple nonprofit charity website to running payment transactions, that the vectors are still pretty much the same. The threat model is still pretty much the same. So I would say that is an important thing to keep in mind for fresh young developers, I would say.
Yeah, and I think the other aspect of security would be transparency. It's about the fact that you should be declarative about what security aspects you are and are not taking on. This ties back both to the earlier conversation we had around how there are some security threats you can't address in a repository, and then we now continue this to sort of go, I don't know if it's a different granularity or not, but not about a repository, but rather about a package. Each of these components, it makes sense. Sometimes your package might be 50 lines of code, and making it enforce security restrictions would reduce its functionality, as well as make it maybe 200 lines of code, and that starts being a little bit cumbersome. But maybe the right way to do it would be to make these packages declare whether or not they enforce security. And just by that sheer statement, you can say, well, can I now ask a question to say, in this flow, am I calling a package that does or does not do security controls? Or, security control is probably also not a black and white flag, but just to be declarative about what security constraints you are proposing or you are taking on, and which security constraints you are not.
Yeah, so to that extent, there may be a bit of a struggle. I know organizations like OWASP try to establish across all applications, these are the common attacks, or these are the common vectors of vulnerabilities. And I think that's good to understand, because we're still seeing that happen. The OWASP top 10 from 5 years or 8 years back is still relevant to today, even though it's a different environment for applications. I wonder, though, if in setting up this common language, common declarative presence about your package, that we spend a lot of time in standardizing something that we forget about different use cases for each. That's something that I just have to think through. I don't necessarily think it's an easy problem to solve, but I think it's relevant. I just don't know the path to get to the final.
Right. Yeah, and it's I guess when you talk about declaring something, then you want to declare it in a non-custom fashion.
Yes.
So if I want to say, I do not allow invalid inputs through. I have input validation. I might have bugs, like maybe I have vulnerabilities there, but at least I have made the attempt to sanitize input, and you use some form of standards to indicate that you did. Then maybe later on a tool like Jax could go on and say, well, you have this sort of chain of actions here that you've performed, none of which claims to be doing input sanitization.
Right.
Because you could Jax has the sophistication, I guess, to try and deduce that itself through sort of the language assessment, but it'll be nice to sort of layer in some declaration. And over time, it also allows us to, a lot of the aspect of security that we struggle with a little bit in the development community is that it's all sticks and no carrots. There's no way to sort of celebrate the success. If you could somehow stamp your package to say, this one has good security controls, clearly you need to implement them, but assuming people don't abuse those flags, it's nice to say, well, a good quality package, has these like 7 security things that it's doing, and you would aspire as a developer to have all of those flags. Yeah. And if you did so, then you'd have some, thumbs up on your repo and on your package, and people can, recommend or sort of applaud you for it, right? You could get a little bit of that value.
Yeah, it's. I think the rating business is good. It'll certainly help. It'll certainly help when you relate that to another package, because those are where those metrics really make the most sense. If I weren't to choose this type of markdown parser or another one, if I look at those ratings, now that my decision process is a lot more clear. I think that really certainly helps. What's going to be challenging is defining the first few packages that get it.
Yeah.
So, but I certainly think this is where the community can really help. Like if that is going to be a value, if the community certainly feels that, we should make that happen by all means. We should all get together to figure out a common protocol so the community can understand what they should be using, and then we in the business that we're doing can make that work. I think that's certainly of value.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we need to keep shouting that from the rooftops, right? And keep getting people to engage and care about security, but try to find these sort of actionable next steps that you could consider doing.
It's an interesting concept as well, crowdsourcing security, because if that was easy to have been done, we wouldn't need to exist. And so in the challenge that we have, security has always been an afterthought. And firms like what we do and firms like us in what we do, it's sort of our responsibility to take that on, like you said, shouting it from the rooftop, be that leader. So at the point that the community understands it, now it becomes a more active engagement. But it's a struggle.
It is, always is, never going to end, but hopefully improves.
Yes, certainly.
So I think we're about out of time.
Wow.
Before we sort of part off, I'd like to ask you maybe one tidbit of a question. Say,
sure.
If you had, just from your experience and what you're seeing, if you're talking to a development team and you have one security aspect or one thing that you think they should apply to make their system more secure, what's your favorite? What's your the current thing that you're championing the most?
There's a lot of answers I can give that. The official answer would be to use jax.codiscope.com. It's a great tool that will help you do that. And this is something that I've sort of indoctrinated among the teams at Codiscope, which is building security in, and that touches different parts of your development process. One that I've seen had the most impact on is at the design step. If you have a security designated role or somebody who can take that on and champion that, and make that part of that design before any code gets written, that is already part of the mindset. That is something that's sitting there when devs are coding. It's always at the back of their mind, but it sits there. And that has a great impact in the way that I've seen the developers of my teams code. So I would say, as part of your design, make a security review step an explicit part of that, and you will see gains out of that. So.
Yeah, that makes
that's just coming
sense.
from personal experience. There's certainly more answers to that, but that's something that I've seen that has had more impact than any other thing that I've seen before.
Yeah, I fully agree. It'll be sort of a high impact step to just acknowledge that security is a core component of some of that process of your flow and of that design.
Yeah.
So thanks a lot, Sabin, for coming. For those who are listening, you definitely should go and check out Jax. It's jax.codiscope.com, and it would probably tell you a few things about your JavaScript code that you may not know, and you definitely should, maybe about how you're using Mongoose, maybe something else.
Yeah.
So thanks again, Sabin, for coming on board, and good luck.
Absolutely. This is a great service you're doing. I think the more we can benefit the community, things like this really help. So thanks a lot, Guy.
That's all we have time for today. If you'd like to come on as a guest on this show or want us to cover a specific topic, find us on Twitter @TheSecureDev. To learn more about Heavybeat, browse to heavybeat.com. You can find this podcast and many other great ones, as well as over 100 videos about building developer tooling companies, given by top experts in the field.